All right, Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. This is Yousuf Raza and we're live with our webinar on the Corona crisis, the promise of life and the threat of death. Yes, this is us trying to make the most of a very perturbing situation, a very disturbing situation. Across the globe, humanity is suffering. Is suffering not just from the coronavirus itself, but the threat that it poses, the anxiety that causes, the possibility of getting infected, the possibility of dying. Although it has always been looming over our head, we have become more acutely aware of it. It is now closer to home. It has become more, it's come closer to us now, right? So with that perspective in mind, with all of that going around, and then what the lockdown has done as to how all routine activities have been disrupted completely. There is practically nothing that we're doing now that we were doing a couple of weeks back. For the most of us, that is what the situation has become. And there is a great tendency to become hopeless. There is a great tendency to become incredibly anxious, excessively perturbed by the entire situation, and then just get lost in that, more than the crisis itself and the threat that it poses. We can become disabled, or we can become completely handicapped psychologically and not get anything done. The idea behind this webinar is to communicate, is to try to get the message across that this corona crisis may well be the best thing that has ever happened to us. And before you jump to any conclusions, I'm gonna use this time at my disposal to try to justify that statement, that there is a huge possibility of that happening, that this can be the best experience for a lot of us, provided we have the right attitude. So just very quickly, all of you know this, but just to put things into perspective, what this coronavirus has done. Financially, businesses have shut down. And yes, big businesses have shut down, but most importantly, people who survive on daily wages. For them, they are not getting those daily wages that is necessary for them to keep the stove burning at their homes. Socially, we're not going to work anymore. We don't have those interactions with our colleagues, whatever it is that we were working on, developing, building. All of it has come either to a halt, or we have to work in very different scenarios from home. The usual friend circles have been disrupted. Spiritually speaking, places of worship have to be deserted, necessarily so, understandably so. People had plans for pilgrimage. All of those have been disrupted. Personally, people are suffering from physical health problems. Those who have been infected, those who are not, are suffering from the anxiety of possibly getting the coronavirus, or suffering in any other way. And then we have the routine that we were used to, that was keeping us sane. That for a lot of us, our routine was helping us manage our stress levels, manage our depression, manage our anxiety. And now all of that routine is out of the window. Whatever it is that we were doing, whatever it is that we were engaged with, is no longer available to us as it was before. Getting up in the morning, attending to your grooming, and then getting in the car, going to your universities or colleges or workplaces, and then spending 8-9 hours there, coming back home. You had an evening routine. Everything was working in a particular order. All of that is gone. All of that is gone. We are more acutely aware of the emptiness in our daily lives. We are bored, and that boredom is bringing to light how empty our lives have become. And we're going to come back to that point of boredom soon, as to what that depicts to us. We're going to come back to all of these points that I'm making. And then, of course, the morbidity and mortality associated with the coronavirus as well. Thankfully, very few people, percentage-wise, have been infected, but by no means is that insignificant. that however many have been infected, it is a serious crisis that they're having to face. And then they're literally having to face the predicament, the possibility of death. And that too, thankfully, is much lower than we feared, but it is still there. And it is debilitating. It is incredibly debilitating, and that has to be looked upon as well. Other dimensions of our lives, people wanted to travel, go here, go there, take in, experience the beauty of nature, not happening. All of that suspended. Intellectual growth that schools, colleges, universities promised, all suspended. Everything coming to a halt. We have to makeshift arrangements of online classes, and all of that is going on. Workshops, conferences, this, that, the third, all of it gone. All of it suspended. One virus, and globally, all of our usual activities of everyone practically doing anything in the society has come to a halt. This is just broadly how in these different dimensions the coronavirus or this pandemic has afflicted us. What I want to focus on now is the attitude that we carry usually in our lives, and how the difference in attitude will make the difference in how we respond to the situation. Viktor Frankl, the founder of logotherapy, he quoted Dostoevsky stating that there is only one thing I dread, not to be worthy of my suffering. So that's what I'm going to try to establish today in this little webinar, as to how do we prove worthy of our suffering. For the most part, for starters, what we have to be wary of is that attitude itself. Are we looking to prove ourselves worthy of our suffering? Or is suffering, any kind of suffering, this particular suffering that we're engulfed in right now, is it the destroyer of pleasures, of all of what we ever wanted? So there's two kinds of attitudes that we may have had. One kind of attitude that I'll just simply state as the spoiled brat attitude. The spoiled brat attitude. You don't necessarily have to be rich to have that attitude. This princess kind of attitude. This kind of attitude that says that walks around with this sense of entitlement. That says that my bottom line in life is to get happiness. My aim in life is to attain happiness. Everything I do is to be happy, and life owes me happiness. If that is the attitude, and let's be very clear, for the majority of us, that is what we hold on to. It is that sense of entitlement that we carry with us. And that's what most of the advertisements appeal to. That's what most of the advertisements succeed in gripping us, in turning us into consumers, is that pursuit of happiness as the ultimate goal of our lives. If that is what it is, if happiness, pleasure is ultimately what we're after, and that's the final determining factor of why we make our choices and why we do whatever we do, then this is a real message. This is a knock on the head that is necessary to send the message home, a realization that, hello, that perspective of life is not going to carry you very far. If despite all the suffering that life has in store for you, and life does have a lot of suffering in store for us, you're not going to be able to face it if predominantly what you're after is bliss, pleasure, happiness, and nothing else. It's a very incomplete picture of life. Yes, happiness is important. It is integral. It is one of the most important things to be pursued. But if it becomes the only thing that is pursued, then forget about the corona pandemic. We cannot face the most insignificant of sufferings that our daily lives present before us. Right? So that's one attitude. That attitude of the spoiled brat, that attitude that carries that sense of entitlement. And then there is that second attitude, the other end of the spectrum, the sense of the one that doesn't carry a sense of entitlement per se, but carries, more importantly, a sense of responsibility. A sense of responsibility. It is that second attitude that is looking for opportunities, that knows that every way, whichever way the tide turns, it is an opportunity to prove yourself worthy of whatever predicament you're in, whether good or bad, whether happiness or suffering. You have to act responsibly. The first one is more passive. It expects things to be done to it, or it expects its actions to produce necessarily a feeling of pleasure and happiness. This second attitude, this is looking towards itself to produce results in that are self-transcendent, that are for something outside of myself, regardless of my feeling of happiness or pleasure. That if my happiness or pleasure, even if it has to be sacrificed, then if it's worth it, it's worth it. We do it. Right? This sense of responsibility is going to is going to be afraid of what Dostoevsky, the quote that I just presented before you, that there's only one thing I dread, not to be worthy of my suffering. Mind you, this particular attitude does not mean you go out looking for suffering. It does not mean that you become foolhardy. It does not mean that you challenge or put yourself through unnecessary challenges and pain for the sake of it. That's just suicidal behavior. That's self-harming. That's not what is intended. That is not heroic in any stretch of the word, or by any stretch of the imagination. So, to be very clear, the spoiled brat attitude that has the sense of entitlement, and then the heroic attitude that has the sense of responsibility. It is these two attitudes that are going to determine whether or not we make the most of the most horrible situations that confront us in life, of the most horrible suffering that we have to deal with. And the current pandemic is included in that. Now, whenever we are confronted with any kind of a situation of suffering, there's two primary ways of responding. The first way of responding is emotional. That necessarily, if there is suffering, and that suffering is because of any pain that you're having to face, or any loss that you have incurred, then that loss results in grief. And so all of the things that we listed that we're having to face as a global community, these, whether it's financial loss, whether that's loss of the social opportunities that you used to have, intellectual opportunities, spiritual opportunities, physical health, all of these are different manifestations of loss. Loss results in grief, right? And grief requires time for emotional processing. Now, what the spoiled brat attitude does is, because it has that sense of entitlement, its emotional processing is going to be very prolonged. Its emotional processing is going to involve a lot of complaining. Its emotional processing will involve a lot of self-victimization. And eventually, its emotional processing will result in resentment. Because I walk around like a spoiled brat with that sense of entitlement, thinking I should be getting pleasure and happiness, and when I don't, I think that I've been dealt with unjustly. And that anger builds up. That resentment builds up. Right? And in the second stage, The first stage, like I said, is emotional response. The second stage is a practical response. So when the emotional processing resulted in anger and resentment and this self-victimization, then it is quite possible, or rather probable, that in the practical phase of the response, it is going to lead to exploitation. I have been denied, I have been deprived of my right to happiness and pleasure or power or what have you. And so I can deny others. And so those are the kinds of people who are using this particular situation of where humanity is already suffering as it is, but they're going to make that suffering worse with their evil. That they're going to turn to exploitation. They're going to turn to they're going to start hoarding supplies. They're going to become COVIDiots. They're going to go out in public and not pay any regards for any of the hand washing measures or any preventive measures or any social distancing. They're just going to be completely, blatantly ignoring all of those and putting themselves and others in danger deliberately. Or they're going to find other ways of using the opportunities to their political agendas, whatever it is for them to aggrandize themselves or aggrandize at the cost of others. They're going to use this particular situation. And that's the sad reality. We are faced not just with suffering, but the evil that compounds the suffering, that makes it even worse. Now, the second attitude that I spoke about, the attitude that has a sense of responsibility, the more heroic attitude that we aspire to develop, because it is looking for opportunities of growth, because it is looking for opportunities of doing better for the society, for themselves, for the people around them. When they are confronted with a situation of suffering, even if it is as global as this pandemic, they also have an emotional reaction to loss. It is very important to understand that being heroic does not mean having a sense of responsibility. Emotional processing will result in resentment. Denying yourself the legitimate right of an emotional reaction to loss. So they're suffering as well. They have incurred loss as well. And as a consequence of incurring that loss, dependent on how big that loss is, they have a right to, and they should give time to that, to emotional processing, for the grief to settle in, for the entire process of grief to go through. So, for example, if it is a personal health issue, getting infected, or losing a loved one, or staring at the possibility of the loss of your own life, then crying it out, being sad about it is perfectly natural. It is very, very human. It is a space that you have to give yourself, right? And the other loss is also included to whatever degree. Well, if it is a personal health issue, getting infected, or losing a loved one, or staring at the possibility of the loss of your own life, then crying it out, being sad about it is perfectly natural. It is very, very human. It is a space that you have to give yourself. Right, and the other loss is also included to whatever degree. Well, if it is a personal health issue, getting infected, or losing a loved one, or staring at the possibility of the loss of your own life, then crying it out, being sad about it is perfectly natural. It is very, very human. It is a space that you have to give yourself. emotional
right?
processing time.
And the other losses also included to whatever degree. If it is a personal health issue, it is not getting infected
the loss that
or losing a loved one or staring at the possibility of the loss of your own life,
for one kind of a
then
personality,
crying it out, something that being sad about it is perfectly natural. It is very, very human. It is a space that you have to give yourself.
Emotional,
right? And the other losses also included to whatever degree. If it is a personal health issue, it is not getting infected or losing a loved one or staring at the possibility of the loss of your own life.
for one kind of a
Then
personality,
crying it out, something that being.
But at the end of the day, it has to be a personal choice. You have to come to terms with your own particular loss. You have to come to terms with your own personality. If you're working in close concert with a therapist, that process can help. Or you have confiding friends or mentors who can facilitate that process or help you in the process. But ultimately, you have to make that choice for yourself as to how long you want that emotional time to be, that processing time to be. How much of your daily routine would you allow for that to would you give to that, and then give to the necessary tasks that you still have to get done? And then you transition into the second stage, which is the practical response to the situation. So far, just highlighting or recapping, reviewing what we've done so far. I spoke about two kinds of people: the spoiled brat who moves around with that sense of entitlement. He should be happy all the time, have all the pleasure, authority that they're looking for, the princess kind of attitude. And then number two is the sense of responsibility, the heroic kind. Both of them, how they deal with loss in its emotional stage is what I just spoke about. Now the second stage, the practical stage. I already said that the one with the spoiled brat attitude is going to look, when it comes to action, to exploit, to take advantage of others, and feel justified in doing so because they feel that they've been unjustly dealt with or treated. But then the heroic attitude, when it comes time for them to act, and this may be going on simultaneously with the emotional processing. It's actually not just possible, it's mandatory. There's a lot of practical actions that have to be done along with the emotional processing. Sometimes we just simply don't have that much time. We don't have we can give ourselves some space to grieve, but where we don't have the luxury of time to do it for very prolonged periods, right? So practically, the response of the heroic, the one with the heroic attitude, the one with the sense of responsibility, the one looking to prove themselves worthy of the suffering that they inevitably have to confront, will be that of meaningful action. Will be that of if life gave me lemons, I'm gonna make lemonade, and I'm not just gonna make lemonade, I'm gonna make lemonade that can serve others, that can help others. So the doctors throughout the world, and particularly in under-resourced areas as Pakistan itself, that without the necessary protective gear are just throwing themselves in there and looking to do whatever it is that they possibly can, your heart goes out to them. That this is as good as it gets. They're incurring a significant degree of loss to themselves. And they are threatened by a great degree, more than anyone else. Yet they're going in there and looking to provide the health care that is necessary to help society to deal with this pandemic, right? So this is the heroic attitude that is necessary. These are the heroes that the doctor, the gentleman martyred in the way of medical service in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in Pakistan, just goes to show that if they carried that sense of entitlement and they had that spoiled brat attitude, you wouldn't find this level of sacrifice. And perhaps we don't have, not everyone is a doctor. Not everyone has that facility or is even required to be out in the field. But we're supposed to, within our own circles of influence, find out what good can we possibly do. How can we help people who are suffering? So your business, my business, they may be suffering for this, that, or the third reason because of the lockdown. But then what about the people on daily wages? Are there any in my vicinity? Are there any in my family? Is there a possibility for me to reach out to them to ensure that them and their kids have enough food to eat? So if I quit wailing, if I quit whining, if I quit just counting the stats on the television day in and day out, I can detach myself from that and attach myself to something meaningful in the society that I can possibly do. So when there are doors that close, there are others that have opened, is what this heroic attitude is capable of seeing. When a door closes in your face, you can either sit in front of it and cry, and that is justified to a certain extent. But if that's all you do, what you miss out on are windows of opportunity around you. And when you explore those windows of opportunity, and especially if they are self-transcendent opportunities for you to go beyond yourself and help others in need, then you help them, yes, but the greatest help that you're giving is to yourself. The growth in your personality, the psychological growth that you're promised, the spiritual elevation that results in the consequence of those meaningful actions, of those self-transcendent actions, it is irreplaceable. You can't put a price tag on that. It's priceless. It is incredibly important for our spiritual growth that we see and identify those opportunities and invest in them. That there are people who, as a consequence of all the loss that is happening in the society, are emotionally more in need than others. So I put my grief to a side and I lend them a shoulder to cry on, with the appropriate social distancing. I'm using it as a metaphor, don't take that literally. And giving them time, giving them support that they require. If all they require is to vent, then I lend them that ear and that emotional validation that is necessary. Right? And it is these times of crises that open these windows of opportunity that would otherwise never have been opened. And so we know for a fact that the greatest discoveries that humanity has made were made in times of crises. In times of war, for example. War is a catastrophe, it is a calamity, it is suffering and evil, all of it combined. And people in the tens and hundreds of thousands, in the millions that suffer as a consequence. But how many of the technological advancements that you and I enjoy, for example, the internet, what is the most integral part of our lives, especially in this crisis, was a development as a result of the Cold War. And it is that and hundreds of other things that we use in our daily lives were a consequence of wartime urgency that was created. Plastic surgery became a thing as a consequence of war. And there are so many other things that we have been able to develop, discover, and create, invent, because we were faced with crises. We did it at the level of humanity. We can do it at the level of individuals. We can do it at personal levels. We can do it from inside of our homes. We can do it professionally. We can do it in all these different departments, right? So it is this heroic attitude which when it is confronted with such a situation is going to look for opportunities of of doing more and more, of doing better. So, for example, we spoke about how there are financial challenges that were faced as a consequence of the situation, but let's see how much more can we develop professionally when we're under lockdown. Perhaps you always wanted to explore opportunities of some kind of freelance work, but you never had time because your job was too exhausting. Perhaps you have that time now. Maybe you had big plans, or you wanted to explore big ideas and plan them out and work them, chalk them out in detail. You never really got the time. You have that time now. Perhaps you can sit with pen and paper and envision what you would want to build of your own to grow financially. So this may be financially difficult for you in certain respects, but it may be opening doors now and or for the future. There may be online or opportunities for your work that you never considered that you can now conceive of if you just open yourself up to those possibilities. So you have challenge socializing with your colleagues or your friends, but this virus, this pandemic has given you an opportunity to spend more time with your family, mend broken relationships, whatever conflicts that you've just been sitting on for so long. You have an opportunity to look towards them and see if you can work them out. See if you can work them out. How many times have you found yourself during routine life complaining, man, I wish I could spend more time with my kids. I wish I could spend more time with my wife. I wish I could spend more time with my parents. I wish I could spend more time with my siblings. Yada, 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 yada. Lo and behold, you have all that time now. You're in the house with them. So were you really serious? Were you really sincere when you made all those comments? When you said all those things? Live up to it. You're denied opportunities of spirituality in congregation, in places of worship. Fair enough, you have that time for reflection and meditation and prayer in private. Explore those possibilities. Come to know yourself better spiritually. Come to terms with your demons that you usually just don't even know are there. This is a time for reflection, for self-analysis. Perhaps you've always been wanting to get into therapy but never really could get yourself to do it or had the time to do it. Maybe you have that opportunity now. That's always an opportunity for spiritual and psychological upliftment. Recitation, memorization, reading of all of those can be spiritually uplifting alternatives that you now have opportunity for that you never had before. One thing that I would want every single one of you listening who wants to have a heroic attitude towards whatever is going on, have a corona plan. Have a lockdown plan for yourself. Have a lockdown routine for yourself. That however much time we're looking at, couple of weeks, whatever it may be, set goals. Set goals for yourself, for your professional development, for your social growth, for your spiritual development, for your physical health. So maybe you can't go to your fitness center or your gym or your whatever it is that you used to do outdoors. Be creative indoors. There's so many, every single workout expert on YouTube is telling you alternatives of what you can do at home for nothing. Live up to it. Live up to it. You wanted to go places and experience the beauty of nature, but then there is beauty that you can experience within yourself at home. You can explore your aesthetic dimension that you've never been able to do before. Perhaps poetry, literature that you never found time for. Explore those dimensions. Perhaps writing. Maybe you wanted to write and never had been able to. Explore that. Maybe you always wanted to learn an instrument. Go ahead. You have the time. Explore those aesthetic dimensions to yourself. Intellectually, yes, we've been deprived of the school college environment, of of whatever seminars and public teaching workshops, whatever it is that we used to have. But now you have access to books at home, reading, growing intellectually. Maybe you wanted to learn a language. Go ahead. There's so much to do. But most importantly, most meaningfully, it is going to be how all of that contributes in you making the world a better place eventually. Making a difference in somebody's life. And that growth, when you have that, it may have been the best thing for you. Right? So it is the final point that I'm going to make is we're not animals confronted with a novel situation of suffering. We're human beings. We're human beings. And one of the very fundamental characteristics of being human is adaptability. Is that we have the freedom to choose our attitudes, whether we want to make it like that of a spoiled brat or that of a hero. We have that choice. So Viktor Frankl said that the destiny a person suffers has the twofold meaning: to be shaped where possible and to be endured where necessary. And then Allama Iqbal, he said that one of the greatest of all things in existence is the human being. And the greatness of the human beings is that when he is attracted by the forces around him, the human being has the power to shape and direct them. But when he is thwarted by them, i.e. brought down by them, closed in, or you don't have the room to operate the way you'd want to, then he has the capacity to build a much vaster world in the depths of his own inner being, wherein he discovers sources of infinite joy and inspiration. It is this that this particular situation and scenario is offering us, that to develop that inner being, that inner world, by developing that heroic attitude, despite all the loss that we're having to suffer, make all the contributions that we have the possibilities to make if only we look around. And then making those contributions, and what that makes us, the kind of people that we become, the kind of community then we're going to be able to make in the aftermath of this pandemic is going to be at a whole different level. You may even be afflicted, but then how you deal with that affliction, even if God forbid, your days are numbered, that you're facing the predicament and possibility of death as a consequence of that infection, it's going to be incredibly more difficult for you. But then even in the time that is left, the marks that you can leave, the inspiration that you can be, the lives that you can positively influence, by simply bearing an attitude of acceptance, of benevolence, of magnanimity in the face of whatever it is that is surrounding us. I know, easier said than done. But I say it because I've learnt it from people who have done it. And they said it after they'd done it. So for the majority of what I have to present in front of you, if some of the quotations that I brought in were from Viktor Frankl, and he is the founder of logotherapy, the most optimistic school of thought in psychology, but not naively optimistic, intelligently informed, mature, a tragic optimism that it espouses. It became possible because its founder suffered through concentration camps and world wars and died, like almost died so many times, faced death like this close, and was able to come back and tell the story, and a story of optimism, a story of positivity, a story of carrying that heroic attitude no matter what. And then not just him, but other great legends that we all fall back on, prophets, founders of nations, and martyrs, people whose heroic attitude, people whose sacrifice makes our life easier today. And if we do not carry on their legacy, then life for our future generation is going to be all the more difficult. And we're going to be responsible. We're going to be the ones to blame. If we want them to have a better life, a safer world, then we got to transcend ourselves. We got to look to develop within ourselves, muster that courage for that heroic attitude. And when we do that, then we will be able to see the promise of life in the threat of death. Thank you very much.